Homeless, widowed father travels for 48 hours straight, but what he finds in the forest. David held little Chloe's hand tightly as he pushed Ethan's wheelchair along the muddy road. His feet ached inside his worn-out boots, and the backpack weighed so heavily on his back that he felt his shoulders burn with every step. But he couldn't stop. Not when he had just lost the last place they called home. The eviction had happened in the early hours of the previous day. 3 months of overdue rent were enough for Mrs. Gable, the landlady, to lose her patience. David still remembered the shame he felt when the neighbors came to their windows to see their few belongings being placed on the sidewalk. Chloe, only 5 years old, asked where they would sleep that night. He didn't know how to answer. Now they had been walking for 2 straight days along deserted back roads in West Virginia. David had sold the little of value that remained to buy bus tickets to the nearest town, but the money only got them that far. The rest of the journey would have to be on foot. Ethan, 8 years old, didn't complain, even though the light rain that started the night before had soaked his wheelchair. With every kilometer, David fought the voice in his head that insisted on reminding him how he had failed. Since Sarah passed 6 months ago, a victim of complications after surgery, he hadn't been able to get organized. The job at the auto repair shop was lost when he started missing work, because he had no one to leave the children with. The neighbors helped at first, but every family had their own problems. Chloe's stomach growled loudly, and she looked up with her hopeful brown eyes. "Daddy, when are we going to eat?" David swallowed hard. Only a few coins remained in his pocket, and they would need to stretch until they found some solution. He had heard from an acquaintance that in a small town about 50 kilometers away, there was temporary work on the farms. It was his only hope. "Soon, sweetheart. We'll stop at the next place we see." Ethan, quiet as he had been since Sarah left, just watched the landscape. David knew the boy understood perfectly well the gravity of the situation, but was trying to protect his younger sister. This premature maturity pained the father's heart, who wished he could give his children back the childhood that circumstances had stolen. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Evening was falling when they spotted a small roadside store. The old building, with exposed brick walls and a wooden porch, seemed to have seen better days. A faded sign announced St. Peter's General Store in letters nearly erased by time. David hesitated before pushing the foggy glass door. Inside, a grey-haired man with a prominent belly was watching a small television behind the counter. His sun-tanned face carried wrinkles that seemed to tell many stories. When he noticed the arrival of the three, he adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and offered a kind smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" David approached the counter, where some homemade sweets were displayed in glass jars. The smell of home cooking made his stomach growl. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller. You can call me Mr. Miller." "Mr. Miller, I wanted to see how much a loaf of bread and maybe a little milk for the children would be." The shopkeeper discreetly observed the family's condition. The clothes dirty from the road, the heavy backpack, the wheelchair adapted with ropes to carry some belongings. His experienced eyes recognized a story of need there. "Of course. Let me see what I have here that's fresh." Miller moved with difficulty to an old refrigerator that made a constant noise. He took out a bottle of milk and some homemade bread his wife had made that morning. When David asked the price, the man did a quick mental calculation. "That'll be $5 total." David counted the coins in his pocket twice. He had exactly $4.20. Embarrassment flushed his cheeks and he lowered his eyes. "Actually, I only have $4.20. Could it be just the bread then?" Miller pretended to recalculate mentally. "Oh, sorry. I did the math wrong. It's $4 even, and this milk bottle is close to its expiration date, so I'll throw it in. I can't really sell it anyway." The white lie didn't go unnoticed by David, who felt his eyes well up. The kindness of that stranger touched a wound he'd been trying to keep closed ever since he found himself forced to rely on the charity of others. He murmured an almost inaudible thank you and took the groceries. Chloe smiled at Mr. Miller and waved timidly. Ethan also offered a rare smile. As they were leaving, Miller called David back. "Hey, son, where are you folks headed?" "Looking for work on the farms in Oak Creek." "Oak Creek? Boy, that's still about 25 miles away, and there's heavy rain forecast for tonight." David felt discouragement tighten his chest. 25 miles with the children, one of them in a wheelchair, would be impossible in one night. "Is there any place around here where we could—" "There's the old gas station, about 2 miles ahead. It's been abandoned a long time, but the roof's still there. Might be better than getting soaked on the road." David thanked him again, and they resumed their walk. The sky was getting dark, and the first raindrops began to fall when they finally found the abandoned station. The concrete structure was still standing, but the fuel pumps had been removed and the windows were broken. Inside the semi-darkness, they discovered they weren't alone. A woman of about 50 was sitting in a corner with 2 plastic bags beside her. When she saw them enter, she stood up warily. "Good evening," David greeted. "Sorry to intrude. We're just looking for a place to wait out the rain." The woman relaxed upon realizing it was a family with children. "No intrusion at all. This place is for anyone who needs it. My name is Martha." David introduced himself, and the children waved timidly. Martha noticed the wheelchair and the state of exhaustion they were all in. "Did you come from far?" "From Gary. We're heading to Oak Creek to look for work." "Oak Creek?" Martha's expression changed. "Listen here, son. I don't know who told you there's work there, but the town's going through some hard times. The city hall laid off a lot of people, and the farms are cutting back workers because of the drought." David's heart sank. That was his only hope to rebuild their life. "What now? Where can I go?" Martha stepped closer and lowered her voice, as if telling a secret. "Look, I overheard some people talking about a place in the woods. They say there's a community there of folks who lost everything and joined up to live a different way. I don't know if it's true, but I heard they help families who are struggling." "Where is it?" "Following the road for another 9 miles or so, there's a trail that goes into the woods. They say it's that way, but son, I don't know if it's a good thing. It could be dangerous." David thanked her for the information and settled with the children in a corner, more sheltered from the wind. He divided the bread into small pieces to make it last and gave a little milk to each. Chloe ate with appetite, but Ethan only picked at his portion. During the night, the rain grew heavier and the sound of the drops on the metal roof echoed in the empty space. David couldn't sleep, thinking about the decision he would have to make in the morning. Continue to Oak Creek and risk finding nothing, or follow Martha's suggestion and look for this mysterious community in the forest. When day broke, Ethan had a fever. His forehead was burning and he coughed frequently. Chloe also seemed worn out, probably catching the same cold as her brother. David knew he could no longer postpone a decision. The children needed a safe, warm place. Martha had left early, but left a note scribbled on a piece of paper. "The trail is past the wooden bridge. Good luck, David." This small kindness gave him the strength he needed to make a decision. They packed their few belongings and resumed their walk. Ethan was visibly ill, but didn't complain when David settled him better in the chair and covered him with the jacket he took off his own back. Chloe walked in silence, holding her father's hand. The wooden bridge appeared after 2 hours of walking. It was an old structure crossing a creek with some loose planks that groaned under the weight. David had to lift Ethan's chair and carry it in his arms to cross safely, while Chloe clung to his shirt. On the other side, as Martha had described, a narrow trail disappeared among the trees. David hesitated for a moment. Entering an unknown forest with 2 children, one of them sick, seemed crazy. But looking back and seeing the empty road that only led to uncertainty was even worse. "Daddy, are we going in there?" asked Chloe, looking at the dense woods. "We are, sweetheart. Maybe we'll find nice people who can help." "And if we don't find anyone?" David crouched down and looked into his daughter's eyes. "Then we turn back and think of something else. But first, let's see what's inside." The trail was uneven and full of exposed roots. Pushing Ethan's chair became a constant challenge. Several times David had to lift the boy and carry the chair separately over the more difficult stretches. Chloe stumbled over branches and got scratched in the bushes, but didn't complain. After an hour of walking through the woods, they found the first signs that other people had passed through there. Pieces of cloth tied to branches, like trail markers, empty cans thrown by the side of the path, footprints in the dried mud. "There are people here, Daddy," observed Chloe, pointing at the footprints. "Yeah, it seems so." Ethan, who had been quiet all morning, finally spoke in a hoarse voice. "I heard voices." David stopped and listened. In the distance, very faintly, he could hear sounds that seemed human. Voices, laughter, maybe even music. His heart raced with hope and fear at the same time. They followed the direction of the sounds for a few more meters until the trail opened into a clearing. What they saw left them speechless. It was as if they had found a small town in the middle of the forest. Dozens of tents and makeshift structures were scattered throughout the clearing, organized in rows. People of all ages moved between the dwellings, some carrying buckets of water, others tending small campfires. Children ran between the trees, playing and laughing. In the center of the community, a woman in her 40s, brown hair tied in a bun, was leading what seemed to be a meeting. She wore simple but clean clothes and spoke with authority to a group of adults sitting on logs arranged in a circle. When she noticed the arrival of David's family, she interrupted the meeting and approached. Her blue eyes were penetrating but not hostile. "Hello, are you lost?" David felt embarrassed by the question. Lost. It was a word that summed up his situation well for the past few months. "Actually, we are looking for help. We heard there's a community here." "Heard where?" "A woman at the old gas station mentioned it. Said you help families in trouble." The woman studied the three carefully. She noted Ethan's condition, who was clearly ill, and the expression of extreme exhaustion on David's face. Chloe hid behind her father's legs. "My name is Rachel. And you are?" "David. These are my children, Ethan and Chloe." "David, what happened to you?" The direct question caught David off guard. He didn't know where to begin or how much he should tell this stranger. "We lost our home. My wife passed away a few months ago and I couldn't keep up with work anymore. We're looking for a place where we can start over." Rachel nodded, as if this were a familiar story to her. "And where did you walk from to get here?" "From Gary. It took us almost 3 days. With a sick child." The observation carried an implicit criticism that made David feel even worse about his decisions. "I didn't have a choice. We had nowhere else to stay." Rachel sighed and looked at the other people in the community who had stopped their activities to observe the newcomers. "Ethan, right? Are you feeling okay?" The boy shook his head no. "He's had a fever since last night," David explained. "Megan," Rachel called a younger woman who was nearby. "Bring the thermometer and the first aid kit." As Megan walked away, Rachel turned back to David. "Look, David, this is a community of people who have chosen to live differently from traditional society. We're not a shelter or a charity. Everyone here contributes with work, and we all have our own reasons for being here." "I understand. I'm not asking for charity. I'm willing to work for any help." "What kind of work can you do?" "I'm a mechanic, but I can do other things too. Construction, basic carpentry, any manual labor." Rachel seemed to consider the answer. Megan returned with the medical supplies and checked Ethan's temperature. 101.3, she announced. "It's nothing serious, but he needs rest and plenty of fluids," said Rachel. "Come with me." She led them to a larger tent in the center of the community. Inside, it was surprisingly organized, with a table in the middle and some chairs around it. Maps and lists were pinned to the canvas walls. "Have a seat," offered Rachel. "Megan, prepare some tea for the boy and bring some soup for them." David sat down with the children, still processing the situation. It all seemed unreal after the difficult days they had endured. "David, I'm going to be direct with you. Our community isn't for everyone. We live sustainably, sharing resources and responsibilities. We don't have electricity, running water, or most urban conveniences. In return, we have security, community, and purpose." "Purpose? How?" "Each person here has a specific role. Some take care of agriculture, others the children's education. Some are responsible for maintaining the structures. Everyone contributes according to their abilities." Chloe was fascinated. looking through the tent opening at the children playing outside. Ethan had rested his head on the table, visibly tired. Megan brought the promised soup and some chamomile tea for Ethan. The aroma of the food made David's stomach growl audibly, reminding him they had eaten very little in recent days. "Eat your fill," said Rachel. "We'll talk more later." The soup was delicious, seasoned with herbs David didn't recognize. Chloe ate with appetite, and Ethan managed to eat almost the whole bowl, despite his fever. As they ate, Rachel watched in silence, seeming to evaluate something. "David, can I ask a personal question?" He nodded yes. "Your wife, how did she pass?" The question hit David like a punch to the gut. It was always difficult to talk about Sarah, especially because he carried a guilt he couldn't overcome. Complications after surgery. It was supposed to be something simple, but there was an infection. "And you blame yourself for that?" Rachel's sharp perception surprised him. "I should have insisted she see another doctor. The first one said it wasn't serious, but she was still in pain. When we finally managed to schedule the surgery somewhere else, it was already too late." "I understand." Rachel didn't offer empty words of comfort, which David appreciated. He was tired of hearing it wasn't his fault when he felt responsible for the delay in proper treatment. "David, you're desperate right now. It's not the best time to make decisions about the future. How about you stay here for a few days until Ethan gets better and you have time to understand how our community works? I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing anything. We have enough space and food. But I need you to understand that if you decide to stay, it's for real. This isn't a place for people looking for temporary solutions." David looked at his children. Chloe had finished eating and was playing with a cloth doll Megan had brought. Ethan seemed more alert after the hot soup. For the first time in days, they seemed relaxed. "I accept staying a few days, but I want to make it clear I'm not used to depending on the kindness of others. Here, no one depends on anyone's kindness. Everyone does their part. Tomorrow, if you feel up to it, I'll show you how things work." Rachel led them to a smaller tent that was vacant. Inside, there were 3 makeshift beds with straw mattresses, but everything was clean and organized. It was much better than anywhere they had slept in the past few days. "Rest today. Tomorrow we'll start talking about how you can contribute." When Rachel left, David sat on one of the beds and looked around. For the first time in months, he was in a place where he didn't have to worry about where they would sleep the next night. But along with the relief came a feeling of distrust. It all seemed too good to be true. Ethan fell asleep quickly, his breathing calmer after the medicine Megan had given him. Chloe explored the tent curiously, testing the firmness of the beds and arranging her new doll in a little corner. "Daddy, are we going to live here?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Let's see how things are around here." I liked Aunt Rachel, and Aunt Megan too. David smiled. It had been a long time since he'd seen Chloe so excited about something. During the night, he listened to the sounds of the community settling down to sleep. Low voices talking, footsteps on the uneven ground, the crackling of campfires being put out. It was comforting to know there was life and activity around, so different from the frightening silence of the abandoned gas station. In the morning, Ethan woke up noticeably better. His fever had gone down and he was hungry. Megan appeared early with breakfast, homemade bread, jams made in the community itself, and fresh goat's milk. "How do you feel today, Ethan?" Megan asked. "Better. Can I play with the other kids?" "Of course, but don't push yourself too much on the first day." Chloe had already made friends with a girl her age who lived in the next tent. The two were talking animatedly about their dolls. Rachel appeared when they finished breakfast. "David, are you up for a tour of the community?" They left the children playing under Megan's care and walked among the dwellings. Rachel explained that the community had been founded 2 years earlier by her and 6 other families who had lost everything in a fraudulent financial scheme. "We decided that instead of trying to rebuild our lives within the same system that had brought us down, we would create something completely new." "And how did you get this land?" "It's an environmental preservation area that had been abandoned. We made an agreement with the proper authorities to occupy it sustainably in exchange for us taking care of the forest conservation." They passed by an impressive vegetable garden where dozens of people were growing vegetables and fruit in an organized way. Further ahead, there was a workshop where some men were making furniture and tools with reforested wood. "Your experience as a mechanic would be very useful here," commented Rachel. "We have a workshop, but no one with advanced technical knowledge. Our generator broke down last week and no one knew how to fix it." David observed the generator sitting idle in the corner of the workshop. It was an old model, but nothing he couldn't diagnose. "I can take a look." "Of course." He spent the next 2 hours taking the generator apart while Rachel explained how the community functioned. He discovered the problem was simple. A part in the ignition system had worn out. With the tools available in the workshop, he managed to improvise a temporary fix. When the generator started working again, a small group gathered around, impressed. It was the first time in months that David had felt useful and competent. "Impressive," said Rachel. "How long has it been since you practiced your profession?" "About 4 months, since I left the shop." "Why did you leave?" David hesitated. The truth was embarrassing, but Rachel had been straightforward with him from the start. "I started missing a lot of work after Sarah died. I had no one to leave the kids with, and Ethan needed some special care because of the wheelchair. My boss was patient at first, but after a few weeks he couldn't keep me on anymore." "And there was no one to help?" "Family, friends. Sarah was an only child and her parents died when she was young. My parents live in rural Georgia and aren't in a position to help. The neighbors tried to help at first, but everyone has their own life." Rachel nodded understandingly. "Here it would be different. The children are the responsibility of the whole community. Ethan would never be without proper care." They returned to where the children were playing. Chloe was teaching her new friend how to comb her doll's hair, while Ethan was talking to an older boy who was showing him how to make kites with recycled materials. "They seem to be adapting well," observed Rachel. "Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen them so relaxed." "David, can I make you a proposal?" He looked at her attentively. "What kind of proposal?" "Stay here for a week. Work in the workshop, contribute your knowledge, see how things work. Then you decide if you want to stay or continue your journey." "And if I decide to leave?" "You leave. No problem at all. No one here is forced to stay against their will." The proposal seemed fair, but David still felt an internal resistance. "Rachel, I need to be honest. I'm not used to living in a community. I've always been very independent." "I understand. But sometimes extreme independence can be a prison, especially when you have responsibilities greater than your individual capacities." The observation hit a sensitive spot. David knew his stubborn independence had contributed to the situation he was in. "All right, 1 week. During the following days, David immersed himself in the work of the workshop. Besides keeping the generator running, he fixed several broken tools and even improvised some solutions to make the community's agricultural work easier. Ethan integrated quickly with the other children. He discovered his wheelchair was useful for transporting materials around the community and became a much-in-demand assistant. Chloe blossomed in the welcoming environment, making friends and participating in group activities. On the 4th day, David realized he hadn't thought about leaving even once. The routine of useful work, the communal meals, and the feeling of belonging to something greater were filling a void he didn't even know existed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, it was during one of the communal meals that David got to know some of the people living there better. Brian, a former engineer who had lost everything in a business bankruptcy and now took care of the farming. Susan, a retired teacher who had created an informal educational system for the community's children. Greg, a carpenter who built the dwellings and furniture using sustainable techniques. Each person had a story of loss and starting over. David realized he wasn't the only one there who had hit rock bottom before finding that place. "David," said Susan during dinner, "Rachel told me you have experience with mechanics. Have you thought about teaching those skills to some of the young people here?" "Teaching? We have some teenagers who would like to learn practical trades. It would be very valuable for the community to have more people with technical knowledge." The idea of teaching had never crossed David's mind. He had always considered himself just an ordinary mechanic with nothing special to offer. I don't know if I have a knack for being a teacher. It doesn't have to be formal, Greg interjected. Just show them how things work. Let them help with the jobs. That's how I teach carpentry. David considered the possibility. Ethan, who was sitting beside him, tugged on his shirt. Dad, you could teach Tyler how to fix bikes. His bike has a problem with the chain. His own son's suggestion surprised him. Ethan rarely talked about his father's work, but seemed proud of his skills. Maybe I can try, said David. The next day, 3 young people from the community showed up at the workshop, interested in learning. David started by explaining the basic workings of engines, then moved on to tools and diagnostic techniques. He discovered he enjoyed sharing knowledge and that the young people were more interested and respectful than he expected. The weekend was approaching, and David found himself putting off the decision about leaving. The children had completely adapted to life in the community. Chloe had learned to help in the communal kitchen, and Ethan had become an expert at tending the small medicinal herb garden that Megan maintained. It was Rachel who brought up the subject on Friday morning. David, how are you feeling about the proposal to stay? He was working on a water pump that had stopped working and didn't look up from his tools. I'm still thinking. What's stopping you from deciding? David stopped working and looked at Rachel. Fear, I guess. Fear of what? Of settling, of stopping fighting, of accepting a life I haven't earned on my own merit. Rachel sat on a nearby bench. David, do you think what you've done here this week has no merit? The generator running, the tools repaired, the young people learning a useful trade? It's different. I'm not gaining anything from it. Aren't you? Your children are happy, safe, learning new things. You're practicing your profession, being useful, being part of something. Is that worth nothing? David didn't know how to answer. His entire life had been measured in terms of salaries, material achievements, the ability to support his family alone. The idea that value could come from other things was foreign to him. David, can I tell you my story? He nodded affirmatively. Before coming here, I was the financial director of a mid-sized company in Charlotte. I earned well, had a nice apartment, a new car, everything society says represents success. Until I discovered that my partner was embezzling money from clients using my signature. So what happened? I lost everything trying to cover the losses. House, car, savings, even my professional reputation. I spent 2 years trying to start over in the city, but no one wanted to hire someone with my record. How did you end up here? I met Brian at a shelter. He was in the same situation as me. We talked a lot about how the system we lived in had failed us, not just individually but as a society. We decided that instead of trying to return to a game where the rules were stacked against us, we would create our own rules. And don't you miss your old life? Rachel laughed softly. You know what I miss the most? The air conditioning in summer. Other than that, my life here has much more purpose and satisfaction than my previous career. But what about the future? What if you get sick? And when you grow old? Those are valid concerns, but they're the same fears we would face in the city, only there we'd be dealing with them alone. Here we have an entire community to face any difficulty. David went back to work at the pump, but the conversation kept echoing in his mind. That night he had a long talk with Ethan and Chloe about what they wanted to do. I like it here, Dad, said Ethan. People don't keep staring at my chair like I'm different, and I feel useful helping in the garden. And you, Chloe? I want to stay. Aunt Susan said she's going to teach me to read better, and there are lots of kids to play with. The children's opinions weighed heavily on David's decision. He realized he was projecting his own fears and insecurities onto a situation that for them was simply good. On Saturday morning, he sought out Rachel to give his answer. I would like to stay, but I have some conditions. What conditions? I want to understand exactly how the community's organization works, who makes the important decisions, how conflicts are resolved, what kind of commitments I would be making. Of course, that's really important. Let's schedule a meeting with the Community Council for Monday. You can ask any questions you want. And I want the freedom to leave if I feel it's not the best for me and the children. That's guaranteed. No one here is a prisoner of any place. David felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He was about to make a radical change in his life, but for the first time in months, he felt he was making an active decision instead of just reacting to circumstances. The meeting with the council was enlightening. David discovered the community operated democratically, with important decisions made in assembly. There were clear rules about work contributions, use of common resources, and conflict resolution. One of the things that impressed him most was discovering they maintained a community fund for medical emergencies and other special needs. It was funded by the sale of crafts they made and by providing services to rural properties in the area. "David," said Susan during the meeting, "we have a specific proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" "We want to create a more structured vocational training workshop. You would coordinate the teaching of mechanics and maintenance, not just for our young people, but also for people from neighboring communities. It would be a source of income for the community and a way to spread our work." The proposal was ambitious and exactly the kind of challenge David didn't know he was looking for. The idea of turning his skills into something that would benefit not just his family, but an entire community, was exciting. "Have you thought about how to structure this?" "We have some basic ideas," replied Rachel, "but we need someone with technical knowledge to develop a curriculum and define what equipment would be necessary." David felt an excitement he hadn't experienced in months. He was being invited not just to survive, but to build something meaningful. "I accept the proposal, and I accept staying in the community." The following weeks were intense. David dedicated himself completely to developing the technical school project. He discovered he enjoyed planning, thinking about teaching methods, imagining how his classes could transform the lives of other young people. Ethan became his unofficial assistant, helping to organize tools and materials. His reduced mobility proved an advantage in certain situations, allowing him to reach tight spaces that others couldn't. Chloe continued to flourish in the community environment. Susan had identified that she had an aptitude for mathematics and began giving her more advanced lessons. The girl also became interested in the community kitchen and was learning traditional recipes from the older women. 3 months after the family's arrival, the teaching workshop was up and running. The first group of students included 4 young people from the community itself and 6 from nearby villages. David discovered he had a natural talent for teaching, being able to explain complex concepts in a simple and practical way. The initiative caught the attention of regional education authorities, who visited the community to understand how they had managed to create such an effective educational program with limited resources. The official recognition opened doors for partnerships and even financial support from government rural education programs. David, who had arrived in the forest as a desperate man fleeing bankruptcy, had become a respected leader in the community. His transformation did not go unnoticed by the other residents, especially Rachel, who saw in him an example of how people in crisis could find purpose and dignity in the community lifestyle. But not everything was perfect. David still struggled with feelings of inadequacy and the sense that he was being helped too much. His resistance to community interdependence created occasional tensions, especially when other members took initiatives related to the care of his children without consulting him first. One particular episode illustrated this tension. Ethan had gotten hurt during play, and Megan took him to the medical post in the nearest town without telling David, who was working in the workshop with headphones on. When he discovered his son had left the community without his permission, David exploded with anger. "You can't make decisions about my children without consulting me," he shouted at Megan in front of several people. "David, it was an emergency. You were busy and the boy was in a lot of pain," Megan tried to explain. "I don't care, they are my children and I am responsible for them." The embarrassment was general. David realized he had overreacted, but his wounded pride prevented him from apologizing immediately. Rachel sought him out later to talk in private. "David, what happened today wasn't about Ethan or about Megan. It was about you." "How so?" "You're still fighting against the idea that you need help. You're treating the community as if it were a threat to your authority as a father. It's just that I don't want my children to think I can't take care of them." "And you think yelling at someone trying to help gives the impression that you have control?" The question stung because David knew Rachel was right. His reaction had been more about his own fears than about the children's well-being. I don't know how to deal with this, Rachel. My whole life was built around the idea that a man should be able to provide for and protect his family alone. Accepting that I need an entire community to raise my children makes me feel like I've failed. David, you're confusing failure with adaptation. Society has changed, circumstances have changed, but you're clinging to a model of masculinity that may have never really worked. What do you mean? Do you think your wife raised the children alone when she was alive? Didn't she rely on neighbors, the school doctors, a whole social support network? David reflected on this. Sarah had always been very social, maintaining close relationships with neighbors and acquaintances. When the children got sick, she knew exactly who to turn to for advice. When she needed to go out, there was always someone willing to help with Ethan and Chloe. The difference is that she knew how to accept help naturally. You're treating this as if it were a personal defeat. That night, David talked with Ethan and Chloe about the afternoon's incident. "Daddy, you got mad at Aunt Megan," observed Chloe. "I did, and I shouldn't have. She was trying to help you guys." "We don't like it when you get mad like that," said Ethan. "It seems like you don't like it here." "I do like it here. It's just that sometimes Daddy is still learning how to live in a community." "We like that people look after us when you can't," admitted Chloe. "It makes us feel safe." The children's honesty struck David deeply. He realized his resistance was creating insecurity precisely in the people he wanted to protect. The next day, he sought out Megan to apologize. "Megan, I wanted to apologize for what happened yesterday. You did the right thing looking after Ethan." "Thank you, David. I understand it must be hard for you." "It is hard, but it's no excuse for treating someone who's trying to help poorly. You can keep looking after the children as you see fit. They trust you." The public apology restored harmony in the community and marked a turning point for David. He began to participate more actively in community decisions and to accept responsibilities that went beyond his immediate family. When the technical school had been running for 6 months, there was a waiting list of young people wanting to join. The program's success led to invitations for David to present the methodology in other rural communities in the region. On one of these trips, he met Jennifer, a nurse who worked at a rural clinic and was interested in implementing health education programs in underserved communities. They talked at length about community education and discovered affinities not just professionally. Jennifer began visiting the community regularly to collaborate on preventive health programs. Her presence brought a new dimension to David's life, who hadn't considered the possibility of a romantic relationship since Sarah's death. The children liked Jennifer immediately. Ethan became interested in the basic medical knowledge she taught, and Chloe was fascinated by the stories Jennifer told about her work in different rural communities. David initially resisted the attraction he felt. He thought it would be a betrayal of Sarah's memory to get involved with someone else. Besides, he feared a relationship would complicate the stability he had found in the community. It was Rachel who helped him see the situation differently. "David, do you think Sarah would want to see you alone for the rest of your life?" "It's not that, it's just, it seems too soon." "Too soon for whom? For you or for the children?" "For everyone, I think. The children seem very comfortable with Jennifer, and so do you, when you're not policing yourself." David knew Rachel was right. In the moments when he let his guard down, he felt at ease with Jennifer in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I don't know how to start over with someone else." "You're not starting over. You're continuing your life with the experiences and lessons you've had. That includes having been married to Sarah. The relationship with Jennifer developed gradually, respecting the time David needed to process his feelings. She perfectly understood the complexities of his situation and never pressured for definitions or commitments. A year after arriving in the community, David found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. He was coordinating a regionally recognized educational program, living in a stable and harmonious community, and building a new romantic relationship. Most importantly, his children were happy, safe, and developing skills they would never have had the opportunity to learn in the city. Ethan had become a little leader among the community's children, using his sharp intelligence to resolve conflicts and organize activities. His physical condition no longer limited him. On the contrary, He had found creative ways to be useful and respected. Chloe had developed a confident and sociable personality, very different from the shy, worried child who had arrived in the forest. She spoke openly about plans for the future, including the idea of becoming a teacher like Susan. The family's transformation did not go unnoticed by the other residents, who saw in them an example of how community life could rescue people from desperate situations. But David knew his journey wasn't over. There were still moments of doubt, days when he questioned whether he had made the right decisions. The urban world continued to exist beyond the forest, with its challenges and opportunities. It was during a conversation with Jennifer that he expressed these doubts for the first time. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm not running away from reality by living here." "What reality?" "The real reality. Formal work, adult responsibilities, competition, professional growth." Jennifer looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "David, do you think what you do here isn't real work? That educating young people, keeping a community running, raising your children aren't adult responsibilities?" "Yeah, but it's different. Here I'm protected. In the real world I'd have to... Have to what? Fight alone against all difficulties? Prioritize money over well-being? Give up quality of life for the illusion of security?" "It's not an illusion. Financial security is important." "It is important, yes, but you have financial security here. Maybe not in traditional terms, but your basic needs are met and you have prospects for growth." David considered the argument. It was true he no longer faced financial hardship. The educational program generated enough income for his personal needs and still contributed to the community fund. "I think my fear is that I'm settling, of stopping growing." "Have you stopped growing? Because from what I see, you've developed more in the last year than many people do in decades of a traditional career." Jennifer's observation made him reflect on all the new skills he had acquired: teaching, educational planning, community leadership, sustainable agriculture. He had become a more complete and versatile person than he ever was as just a mechanic. This conversation marked another turning point in his adaptation to community life. David stopped seeing his choice as an escape or settling and began to understand it as an alternative but equally valid way of building a meaningful life. The second year in the community brought new challenges and opportunities. The educational program had caught the attention of non-governmental organizations working with rural development. David received invitations to participate in conferences and workshops on sustainable education. Initially reluctant to leave the community, he ended up agreeing to participate in an event in Charlotte about innovations in rural education. It would be his first return to a major urban center since he had arrived in the forest. The experience was revealing. The contrast between the frenetic pace of the city and the tranquility of the community made him value his life choice even more. But it also made him realize that he had developed a unique perspective that could contribute to broader discussions about social development. His presentation at the event was a success. David spoke about how self-managed communities could create innovative and sustainable educational solutions. Several educators and public managers became interested in the methodology he had developed. Back in the community, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from a federal university that had learned of his work and was inviting him to collaborate on research about community education. "It's an incredible opportunity," said Jennifer when he showed her the letter. "But it would mean traveling several times, maybe even being away from the community for long periods." "And does that scare you?" "It scares me because I don't want to live with instability anymore. The children are settled here. I've found my place." David, accepting the collaboration with the university doesn't mean abandoning the community. It means expanding your impact. How so? If your methodology is studied and documented academically, it can be replicated in other communities. You'd be multiplying the good you do here. The prospect of greater social impact was tempting, but David still felt unsure about balancing new commitments with his local responsibilities. It was Ethan who offered an unexpected perspective. "Dad, we can go along sometimes. It would be cool to see a university." "And it would be good for you too," added Chloe. "Aunt Susan said you're very smart and that you should share what you know with more people." The children's support was decisive. David realized they had developed enough emotional security to support his professional growth plans. He accepted the collaboration with the university under specific conditions. The activities would be organized to minimize his absence from the community, and part of the work would be done remotely through technology that the university itself would provide. The research project lasted 2 years and resulted in an academic publication about community models of sustainable technical education. David became a reference on the subject, being regularly invited for lectures and consultations. But what made him most proud was seeing how his experience was inspiring the creation of similar programs in other regions of the country. Letters regularly arrived from educators and community leaders who had implemented adapted versions of his methodology. By this time, Ethan was 12 and Chloe was 9. Both had developed impressively within the community environment. Ethan had discovered a talent for math and science, and Susan believed he had the potential to pursue an academic career in the future. Chloe had become interested in art and agriculture, dividing her time between drawing lessons with a community artist and work in the organic garden. David's relationship with Jennifer had also evolved. They had married in a simple ceremony in the community itself, with the participation of all the residents. Jennifer had moved to the forest, bringing her medical knowledge to benefit the entire community. The new family was functioning harmoniously. Jennifer had become a mother figure to Ethan and Chloe, without trying to replace the memory of Sarah, but offering genuine love and care. The children called her Aunt Jennifer, a title that reflected affection without forcing a premature intimacy. In the 3rd year in the community, David was presented with an opportunity that would definitively test his commitment to communal life. An international organization had offered a position as coordinator of rural educational programs, which would require moving to Washington, D.C. and frequent travel throughout Latin America. The salary was substantial, 5 times more than he earned with his community projects. The opportunities for professional growth were exceptional. It was exactly the kind of offer he would have considered a dream in his previous life. But now, the decision wasn't simple. Accepting would mean leaving the community, uprooting the children again, giving up the lifestyle they had built together. "What do you want to do?" asked Jennifer when he told her about the offer. "Honestly, part of me is tempted. It's a chance to return to conventional professional life, to have traditional financial security." "And the other part?" "The other part knows it would be crazy to give up what we have here," Jennifer smiled. "Then why are you in doubt?" "Because I'm afraid I'm choosing out of cowardice, that I'm avoiding challenges because I'm comfortable here." "David, answer me one thing. Are you happy here?" "I am." "Are the children happy here?" "They are." "Do you feel you're contributing to something important?" "I do." "Then why do you need external validation to know you made the right choice?" Jennifer's question went straight to the point. David realized his temptation with the offer came not from genuine dissatisfaction with his current life, but from a part of him that still sought social approval. He respectfully declined the offer, explaining that he had found a purpose more aligned with his values in community education. The organization understood his decision and even suggested they keep in touch for future specific collaborations. In the following years, David continued developing and refining his educational programs. The community grew and evolved, attracting new families and establishing partnerships with other similar communities in the region. Ethan, now 15, had excelled so much academically that he received a scholarship to attend high school at an excellent technical school in Charlotte. At first, David was worried about the separation, but Ethan insisted he wanted to accept the opportunity. "Dad, I want to study so I can one day return and contribute even more to the community. Maybe I can become an engineer and help with sustainability projects." Ethan's maturity was impressive. At 15, he had a clear vision of how he wanted to use his education to benefit the community that had welcomed him. Chloe, now 12, had become a natural leader among the younger children. She organized activities, mediated conflicts, and showed a special talent for teaching. David could see in her traces of the welcoming personality Sarah had possessed. In the 5th year in the community, David looked back and barely recognized the desperate man who had arrived there pushing a wheelchair down the muddy road. He had become a respected educator, a community leader, a husband and father who could provide not only material sustenance, but emotional stability and growth opportunities for his family. The community had also transformed. What had begun as a group of people in vulnerable situations had become a reference in sustainable living and community education. They received regular visitors from universities, NGOs, and even government authorities interested in understanding how they had created such a successful model. David knew there were still challenges ahead. The children would grow up and have to make their own decisions about where and how to live. The community would face pressures from urban development and changes in environmental policies. He himself would continue evolving and perhaps discover new paths for his social contribution. But one thing had become clear over these years. The choice he had made that night at the abandoned gas station had been the best of his life. Not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it had opened possibilities he never imagined existed. One Friday afternoon, as he watched Ethan teach basic math to a group of younger children and Chloe organizing a theater presentation with the teenagers, David felt a deep peace. This was not the life he had planned, but it was the life he had built from adversity, love, and the courage to accept help. Jennifer approached and stood by his side, watching the children. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as tragedy." "How so?" "If I hadn't lost Sarah, if I hadn't lost my job and my home, I might never have discovered that there was a different way to live, a more connected, more meaningful way." "Do you think Sarah would approve of your choices?" David smiled. It was a question he had often asked himself in the early years in the community. "I think she would be proud to see the man I've become and the people our children are becoming, and I think she would like this community life. She was always more sociable than me. She would be part of this extended family we've created. Yes, she would." That night, during the weekly community dinner, David was invited to speak about the family's 5 years in the community. It was a tradition they kept to celebrate important milestones in the residents' lives. "When we arrived here," David began, "I was broken in every possible way. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. I thought my life was over, and all I had left was to drag the wreckage." He looked at Ethan and Chloe, who were watching him attentively. "Today I understand that that day was not the end of my life, but the beginning of the life I was really meant to be living. A life where my children grow up in a community that values them, where my work has a real impact on people's lives, where I am part of something bigger than my own survival." The words came naturally, without preparation, but loaded with the emotional truth of his journey. "I learned that strength is not in doing everything alone, but in knowing when to ask for help and how to contribute to a community. I learned that success is not measured only in money, but in the quality of the relationships we build and the legacy we leave for future generations." The audience listened in respectful silence. Many there had gone through similar journeys of loss and rebuilding. "Most importantly, I learned that it's possible to start over at any point in life, as long as we have the humility to accept help and the courage to reimagine what our life can be." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot, as we are just starting out, now continuing. After dinner, David walked alone to the edge of the clearing where it had all begun 5 years earlier. The trail he had arrived on with the children was still there, but now it was well marked and maintained, used regularly by visitors and new residents. He remembered the desperate man who had pushed a wheelchair down that trail, carrying only a few clothes and a lot of shame in his backpack. Now that trail represented not an end, but a beginning, not an escape, but a discovery. Ethan appeared quietly by his side. "Dad, were you lying when you said we might leave the woods?" David laughed. At 15, Ethan had the insight to perceive the emotional nuances of adults. "I wasn't lying, Ethan. At that moment, I really thought it was only temporary. I couldn't imagine we could have a good life here. And now? Now I know this is our home, even when I leave to study." David put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Especially when you leave to study, because you'll know you'll always have a place to return to, a community that loves and supports you. I will come back, Dad. Maybe not to live here forever, but I'll come back to contribute. This community is part of who I am. I know you will, and that makes me very proud. Chloe joined them, carrying the cloth doll she had received on her first day in the community. At 12, she still held on to some ties to childhood, but already showed signs of the determined young woman she was becoming. Dad, Aunt Jennifer said you sometimes got sad thinking about Mom. That's true, especially in the beginning. Do you still get sad? David considered the question carefully. Sometimes I miss Mom, but I don't get sad thinking about her anymore. I'm grateful I had her in my life and that you both carry a little of her in you. How do we carry her? Ethan has her curiosity for learning new things. You have her kindness toward people, and you both have the strength she had to face difficulties. They stayed silent for a few minutes, watching the community lights spread across the clearing. It was a moment of family intimacy that David had learned to deeply value. Kids, you know I love you more than anything in the world. We know, Dad, replied Chloe. And you know that everything I do is with your well-being in mind. We know, said Ethan. And we also know you made the right choices. The validation from his children touched David deeply. For a long time, he had questioned whether his decisions were what was best for them or just easier for him. Now he had confirmation that the fruits of his choices were positive for the whole family. In the following months, as Ethan prepared to leave for his studies in Charlotte, David dedicated himself to consolidating the community's educational programs. He wanted to ensure the work would continue running well, even with his attention partially turned to other activities. The Federal University had proposed turning the methodology he developed into a permanent extension program, which would mean regular resources and formal academic recognition. It was an opportunity to definitively legitimize the community's work and create a replicable model for other regions. But David had learned to be cautious with opportunities that seemed too perfect. He insisted on carefully studying the partnership terms to ensure the community's autonomy was preserved. My biggest concern is that academic bureaucracy kills the flexibility that makes our method effective, he explained to Jennifer. You're right, but it could also be a chance to influence how academia approaches community education. How so? If you're part of the process, you can ensure the community's principles are respected. It could be a way to educate the educators. Jennifer's perspective made sense. David had learned that running from institutions wasn't always the best strategy. Sometimes it was more effective to work within them to promote change. He accepted the partnership under specific conditions that guaranteed the community an active voice in decisions and the right to veto changes they deemed unsuitable. It was a long negotiation process, but one that resulted in a respectful and mutually beneficial collaboration. The extension program was launched at an event that brought together educators, public administrators, and representatives from various rural communities. David presented not only the technical methodology, but the philosophy of community life that made truly transformative education possible. Technical education, he said to an audience of 200 people, isn't just about teaching practical skills. It's about shaping people capable of contributing to their communities, solving problems collectively, and living sustainably. The lecture was very well received and generated interest from international organizations working with rural development in other countries. David began receiving invitations for consulting and lectures outside the US. At first, he resisted these opportunities because he didn't want to be away from the community for long periods, but Ethan and Chloe encouraged him to accept some of the more significant opportunities. Dad, you can help communities in other places just like this one helped us, said Ethan during a conversation about an invitation to work with rural cooperatives in Peru. But I don't want to abandon you. You won't abandon us. We know you always come back, assured Chloe. The children's maturity continued to surprise David. They had developed an emotional security that allowed them to support his professional projects without fear of abandonment. He accepted the consulting job in Peru, which would last 3 weeks. It was his first international trip and an opportunity to see how principles of community life applied in different cultural contexts. The experience was enriching. David discovered that the challenges of rural communities were similar in many countries, but the solutions needed to be adapted to local realities. He returned home with new ideas and a broader perspective on his work. More importantly, the trip confirmed that his identity was no longer tied only to the American community where he lived. He had developed an expertise and a passion that could be applied anywhere, but always with the goal of returning and contributing to his home. When Ethan left for Charlotte at the start of the school year, David felt a mix of pride and melancholy. It was the first major separation for the family since they arrived in the forest, but it also represented the success of everything they had built together. "Are you sure you want to go?" asked David on the day of departure. "I am, Dad, and I'm sure I want to come back too. That's the difference." Ethan had articulated something fundamental. He wasn't leaving the community out of rejection or necessity, but by a conscious choice for growth. And his commitment to return demonstrated that community life had been internalized as a value, not just accepted as a circumstance. With Ethan studying away, the family dynamic changed. Chloe developed an even closer relationship with Jennifer and took on greater responsibilities in the community. David had more time to dedicate to the educational program's expansion projects. It was during this period that he received news that would test his adaptability once again. Rachel, the leader who had welcomed his family, announced she would leave the community to care for her elderly mother in another town. Rachel's departure represented a significant change in the community's leadership. She had been not only a competent administrator, but a guiding vision for the group. Her exit would force everyone to rethink how the community would function in the future. David was invited by the council to take on a greater leadership role, but he hesitated. Leading would mean less time for the educational programs and more administrative responsibilities. "I don't know if I have the right profile to lead the entire community," he confessed to Jennifer. "Why not?" Rachel had a broad vision, knew how to handle conflicts, had a natural charisma for bringing people together. "I'm more technical, more focused on specific projects." "David, do you think the community needs a replica of Rachel or needs a leadership that reflects its current values?" Jennifer's question made him reflect on how the community had evolved in recent years. They had grown, diversified, established external partnerships. Perhaps they needed a different kind of leadership. "Besides," added Jennifer, "you wouldn't be leading alone. The council is stronger now. There are more people with management experience." David decided to accept the invitation, but proposed a collaborative leadership structure instead of a traditional top-down model. It would be an experiment in collective management that reflected the community values they all championed. The transition was smoother than expected. David discovered that his teaching skills translated well into facilitating meetings and mediating discussions. His experience with external projects brought a valuable perspective to strategic decisions. Under his collaborative leadership, the community launched new projects: a sustainable educational tourism program, an organic products cooperative, and a research center for family farming. Each project was managed by specialized groups, but coordinated in a way to benefit the entire community. The educational tourism was particularly successful. Groups of university students, teachers, and public managers came to spend time in the community to learn about sustainability and alternative education. The income generated helped the community invest in infrastructure improvements without losing its characteristic simple way of life. In his 6th year in the community, David received a proposal that made him reflect deeply on his journey. A publisher wanted him to write a book about his experience of personal transformation and developing community education. "It would be a way to systematize everything you've learned," argued the editor during a video conference, "and it could inspire other people in similar situations." The idea of writing a book was intimidating for David, who had always considered himself a practical man, not a theorist or writer. But he also recognized the potential value of formally documenting his journey. "I'm not a writer," he said to Jennifer. "I don't know if I can turn experiences into text." "You don't need to be a literary writer. You need to be honest about your experience. People connect with authenticity, not perfect prose." David decided to accept the challenge but proposed a different approach. Instead of a traditional autobiographical book, he would write a practical handbook on community education interwoven with his personal story. The writing process proved to be therapeutic. Revisiting his journey from the eviction to community leadership made him recognize patterns and lessons he hadn't consciously identified. It also helped him fully process the transformation he had undergone. Writing about Sarah was especially difficult, but necessary. David realized he had avoided fully confronting his feelings about losing her and his role in the delay of proper medical treatment. The writing process forced him to make peace with the guilt he still carried. Sarah wasn't just my wife, he wrote in one of the chapters. She was my emotional anchor, my moral compass, my connection to the community around us. When she left, I lost not just a person, but a way of being in the world. I had to learn from scratch how to be a single father, how to ask for help, how to build social connections. The book took 2 years to complete. During this period, Ethan excelled in his studies in Charlotte and visited the community regularly. He had chosen environmental engineering as a career, with plans to specialize in sustainable technologies for rural communities. Chloe, now 14, had developed an interest in psychology and pedagogy. She helped Susan teach the younger children and showed a natural talent for understanding and supporting people with emotional difficulties. When the book was published, it received a surprisingly positive reception. Educators, social workers, and people in crisis situations found inspiration and practical guidance in David's narrative. The book's success brought more visibility to the community, which began receiving delegations from other regions interested in replicating the model. David found himself in a position of influence he had never imagined having, but along with recognition came new pressures. Organizations wanted to formalize partnerships. Governments offered funding that came with bureaucratic restrictions. Companies suggested sponsorships that could compromise the community's autonomy. How do we maintain our values while growing in influence? David asked the council during a meeting about a partnership proposal from a multinational that wanted to associate its brand with the community's projects. Perhaps the question is this growth in influence helping us achieve our goals, or is it distancing us from them? Suggested Susan. The observation led to a deep discussion about the community's future direction. Some members saw partnerships as opportunities to expand their impact. Others feared that commercialization would corrupt the project's authenticity. David found himself divided. Part of him wanted to seize the momentum to create change on a larger scale. Another part feared that external success would destroy the simplicity and intimacy that made community life special. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Ethan, during one of his visits. "Dad, do you remember why you decided to stay in the community? To give stability and community to you and to me. And did you achieve that?" "I did." "Then perhaps the question isn't how to grow, but how to protect what you've already built while helping others build something similar in other places." Ethan's wisdom at 18 impressed David. His son had articulated a strategy that would preserve the community's essence while expanding its impact. From that conversation, David proposed a different approach to partnerships. Instead of bringing external projects into the community, they would create a consultancy program that would take their knowledge to other places. The community would maintain its original scale and characteristics, but David and other specialized members would travel regularly to help create similar communities in other regions. It was a way to multiply impact without compromising identity. The consultancy program was a success. In 3 years, David had helped create or strengthen 15 sustainable communities in different states of the U.S. Each adapted the basic principles to their specific local realities. The itinerant work also enriched his perspective. David learned that there was no single model of community life. Each group found its own way to balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility, economic sustainability with social values. In the 8th year in the community, David faced an important personal decision. Ethan had graduated in environmental engineering and received a scholarship for a master's degree at a Canadian university specializing in sustainable technologies. "It's an incredible opportunity," Ethan said during a family dinner, "but it means being out of the country for 2 years." "Do you want to go?" asked David. "Very much, but I also want to make sure you support the decision." Chloe, now 16 and about to finish the community's alternative high school, was the first to respond. Ethan, you always said you wanted to study so you could come back and contribute more. This is your chance to learn things that can benefit not just our community, but all the others you're helping to create. The maturity of his children continued to surprise David. They had developed a long-term vision and a commitment to purposes greater than their immediate needs. "You have our blessing," said David, "but promise you'll keep in regular touch." "I promise, and I promise I'll use everything I learn to strengthen this work." Ethan's departure for Canada marked another point of transition for the family. Chloe was preparing to make her own decisions about the future, showing interest in studying psychology at a university that offered outreach programs in rural communities. David found himself entering a new phase of life, that of a father to independent young adults who had consciously chosen to continue family values, but on their own scales and in their own contexts. "Have you thought about what you'll do when Chloe leaves too?" Jennifer asked one night as they walked through the clearing. "Continue the work, I imagine, but it will be different not having both of them here." "It will be different, but not necessarily worse. You'll have more freedom to travel, more time to dedicate to new projects." "And you? Don't you feel we missed the best years of raising them?" Jennifer stopped and looked at David with a tender expression. "David, we didn't miss anything. We participated in shaping two exceptional people who consciously chose to perpetuate positive values. That's more than most parents achieve." "You're right. It's just that sometimes I feel time passed too quickly." It did, but it was time well lived. In the 9th year in the community, David received a call that would change his perspective once again. It was from a United Nations organization that was developing a global sustainable education program for rural communities. "Mr. David," said the UN employee, "your work in Brazil has caught our attention. We would like to invite you to coordinate a pilot project in 3 Latin American countries." The proposal was ambitious. 2 years coordinating the implementation of community education programs in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, based on the methodology he had developed. "Would it be a full-time contract?" asked David. "It would be, but with flexibility for regular returns to Brazil. We understand you have family and community commitments." David asked for time to consider. It was the most significant professional opportunity of his life, but it would also represent a radical change in the family routine. That night, he called a family meeting to discuss the proposal. Ethan participated via video conference from Canada. "It's a chance to apply everything you've learned on a much larger scale," said Ethan. "How many communities could benefit?" "The initial project plans to work with 30 communities, but the idea is to create a model that can be replicated in hundreds of places." "Dad, you have to accept," said Chloe. "This is exactly what all your work has been building towards." "But it would mean being away from you and the community a lot." "Daddy," said Chloe firmly, "you taught us that sometimes we need to make difficult choices for a greater good. This is one of them." Jennifer also supported the decision. "David, you've built a solid foundation here. The community no longer depends on your daily presence, and this international work can strengthen everything you've done locally." Faced with the family's unanimous support, David accepted the UN's invitation. It was a difficult decision, but one that represented the natural culmination of his journey from the desperate man who had arrived in the forest 10 years earlier. The 2 years of international work were intense and transformative. David applied and adapted his methodology in diverse cultural contexts, learning as much as he taught. He developed protocols that allowed for the replication of community principles while respecting local specificities. Most importantly, he proved that the values of cooperation, sustainability, and participatory education that had transformed his own life were universal and adaptable. During this period, Ethan completed his master's degree and returned to the US to begin a doctorate focused on renewable energy technologies for isolated communities. Chloe entered university, studying psychology with a specialization in community development. David's work for the UN resulted in the creation of an international network of sustainable educational communities. When he returned permanently to the US, he found his original community strengthened and expanded, having become a reference center visited by people from all over the world. In the 11th year in the community, David celebrated his 55th birthday at a party that gathered current residents, former residents who had followed other paths, international consultants and families from other communities in the network. Ethan, now a doctor and researcher, presented his doctoral project, a solar microgrid system designed specifically for sustainable rural communities. Chloe, a psychology graduate, announced she would open a psychological support center for families transitioning to community life. "You know," David said during his birthday speech, "when I arrived here with Ethan and Chloe, I thought I was running away from life. Today I understand I was actually running toward the life I was always meant to live." He looked at the crowd gathered in the clearing that had been his first contact with the community. "I learned that family isn't just blood, but people who choose to walk together. I learned that work isn't just about making money, but contributing to something bigger than ourselves. I learned that success isn't about accumulating things, but creating connections and leaving a positive legacy." The party continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and stories. It was a celebration not just of a birthday, but of a complete journey of transformation that had begun on a muddy road more than a decade earlier. In the days following the birthday, David spent time reflecting on his journey. Walking the forest trails he now knew like the back of his hand, he thought about all the choices that had led him there. The decision to accept Rachel's help on the first day, the choice to stay beyond the initial week, the courage to open himself to a relationship with Jennifer, the determination to create innovative educational programs. Each decision had built upon the previous one, creating a life he could never have imagined. But he also recognized that not all choices had been his. Circumstances beyond his control, Sarah's death, the loss of his job, the eviction, had created the crisis that forced him to seek alternatives. "Sometimes," he reflected during a conversation with Jennifer, "I wonder what would have happened if I had managed to maintain my previous life. If I had found another job, another apartment." "Would you have been happy?" asked Jennifer. "I probably would have been comfortable but happy, fulfilled, I don't know." "Do you think Ethan and Chloe would have had the opportunities they've had?" David considered the question. Ethan was developing technologies that could benefit millions of people in rural communities. Chloe was preparing for a career dedicated to community well-being. It was hard to imagine they would have found these paths in a traditional urban life. Probably not. They would have followed more conventional paths. "And do you think that would be better or worse?" "Different. Neither better nor worse, just different, but less aligned with who they really are." The conversation made him realize something important. His journey hadn't just been about surviving a crisis, but about discovering who he really was when freed from conventional expectations. David had spent the first half of his life trying to fulfill predefined social roles: the responsible worker, the provider husband, the protective father. These roles weren't bad, but they were limiting. The crisis had forced him to discover parts of himself he had never explored: the educator, the community leader, the social visionary. In the 12th year in the community, David started a new personal project, a second book that would document not only his own transformation, but the transformation stories of the dozens of people he had met throughout his journey. "I want to show," he explained to Chloe, who was helping him with interviews, "that there isn't a single model for starting life over. Each person finds their own path, but there are common principles that can guide any process of change." The second book project led him to reconnect with people he had met in different phases of his journey. Miller, the shopkeeper who had been kind on the first day of walking. Martha, the woman from the abandoned gas station who had given the first clue about the community. Megan, the first person who had cared for Ethan when he was sick. Each reunion revealed layers of his story that he hadn't perceived at the time. Miller shared that hadn't been the first family in need he had helped, and that several others had followed similar paths. Martha revealed that she herself had found stability in a rural community after years of living on the streets. "You know what impresses me most about your story," said Megan during one of the interviews. "It's that you didn't just survive the crisis, you transformed the crisis into purpose." Megan's observation captured something essential that David had taken years to fully understand. His journey hadn't been about overcoming adversity to return to a previous life. It had been about using adversity as a catalyst to create a completely new and more meaningful life. The second book was published in David's 13th year in the community, titled Stories of New Beginnings: How Crises Can Open Paths to Fuller Lives. The book became a reference for people facing major life transitions. But for David, the book's true success wasn't in sales or reviews. It was in the letters he received from readers telling their own stories of transformation, people who had lost jobs and discovered callings, families who had faced crises and found more authentic ways of living together. "You've created a replicable hope," said Ethan during one of his visits. "You showed that it's possible not only to survive loss, but to thrive in unimaginable ways." In the 14th year in the community, David faced a new personal transition. At 57, he began to think seriously about his legacy and about how to ensure the continuity of the work he had developed. Ethan, now established as an internationally renowned researcher in sustainable technologies, had received an offer to direct a renewable energy research institute. Chloe had specialized in community therapy and coordinated psychological support programs in several communities in the network. Both children were building independent careers, but maintained strong ties to their original community and the values they had learned there. "You know," said David during a family dinner, "you've exceeded all the expectations I had when we arrived here." "How so, Dad?" asked Chloe. "I hope to give you stability and a basic education. You've become leaders in your fields, people who are changing the world for the better." "But it wasn't just the community that shaped us," said Ethan. "It was seeing you reinvent yourself, seeing that it's possible to start over at any time, that we don't have to accept limitations imposed by circumstances. You taught me as much as I taught you." The family conversation led David to reflect on his own future. At 57, he still had potential decades of contribution ahead. The question was how to use that time most impactfully. Jennifer, now 50, had become a respected leader in the field of community health, coordinating preventive medical programs throughout the network of communities. Her experience and wisdom perfectly complemented David's skills. "Jennifer, have you thought about how we want to live the next 20 years?" asked David on an evening walk. "I have, and I think we want to keep doing what we're doing, but perhaps a little differently." "How differently?" "Less operational work, more mentorship. Let the younger generations take on the execution while we provide strategic guidance." The suggestion made sense. David realized he was beginning to repeat himself in his projects, applying solutions that had worked in the past instead of innovating. It was a sign that perhaps it was time to pass the torch to people with fresher energy and perspectives. In the 15th year in the community, David announced his transition to an advisory role. He would remain involved in the educational programs and the international network of communities, but as a mentor and advisor instead of an operational coordinator. The transition was easier than he had anticipated. A new generation of leaders, many of them former students of the programs he had created, took on the operational responsibilities with competence and enthusiasm. David discovered he enjoyed the role of mentor. He could share his experience without carrying the weight of day-to-day decisions. He had more time for reflection, for writing, for deep conversations with people who were facing their own journeys of transformation. "You know what surprises me the most?" said Rachel during a visit to the community. She had returned after caring for her mother and was impressed by the changes. "What?" "How you became exactly the type of person I expected you to become when I met you 15 years ago." "How so?" "You arrived here as a broken man, but I could see there was something special in you. A determination, an intelligence, a capacity to grow that just needed an opportunity. You saw that?" "I felt like a complete failure." "I did. And that's why I insisted you stay. I knew you could contribute a lot to our community. I didn't imagine you would transform it so much." Rachel's observation touched David deeply. It was comforting to know someone had seen potential in him when he himself could not see it. At 60, in the 18th year in the community, David looked at his life with a deep satisfaction he had never experienced in his youth. It wasn't the satisfaction of having accumulated wealth or status, but the satisfaction of having lived according to his deepest values. Ethan had married and had a son, continuing the family tradition of raising children in welcoming communities. Chloe had found a partner who shared her passion for social work, and together they ran an organization that brought psychological support to rural communities across the United States. The original community had become a model studied in universities around the world. The international network that David had helped create included over 200 communities in 15 countries. But for David, the true success wasn't in the numbers or the recognition. It was in the letters he still received from people telling how his story had inspired changes in their own lives. It was in the young people who arrived at the community lost and left with purpose. It was in the certainty that he had used his life to make the world a little better. "Do you have any regrets?" asked Jennifer one Sunday morning, as they drank coffee watching the community's activity. David reflected for a moment. "I regret taking so long to learn that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. I regret resisting community life so much at the beginning. But the rest? No, not even the hard parts. Not even losing Sarah. Especially Sarah. She taught me to love deeply, and that capacity to love was fundamental to everything I built afterward. Her memory guided me through difficult times. Do you think she would be proud of who you've become?" David smiled. "I think she would be surprised but proud, and I think she would love this extended family we've created." At 65, David decided to write a third book. It would be his most personal work, a reflection on conscious aging and on how to use the final decades of life to maximize contributions to the common good. "I want to write," he explained to Ethan during a video conference, "about how maturity can be the most productive period of life, not the beginning of decline." "You certainly are an example of that, Dad. It's just that I see many people my age retiring, not because they want to stop contributing, but because they don't know how to contribute in ways different from what they've always done." The third book became a manifesto on active and purposeful aging. David argued that society wasted enormous human resources by marginalizing older people, when in fact they possessed wisdom and perspective that could be crucial for solving complex problems. In the 20th year at the community, David's original family gathered for a special celebration. Ethan brought his 2 children, now 10 and 17. Chloe was pregnant with her first child. Jennifer had become a grandmother in heart to David's biological grandchildren and was preparing to be a real grandmother to Chloe's future baby. "Do you realize," said David during the celebratory dinner, "that we are raising the 3rd generation of our community family?" The children, who had grown up visiting the community regularly, felt completely at home there. They spoke naturally about sustainability, cooperation, and social responsibility. They were living proof that community values could be passed down through generations. "Grandpa," said the 10-year-old granddaughter, "when I grow up, I want to work with communities like you. And what would you like to do specifically?" "I want to teach children about how to take care of nature and about how people can live together without fighting." The child's innocence and wisdom touched David deeply. She represented everything he had hoped to achieve, a generation that would grow up considering community life and sustainability not as radical alternatives, but as natural ways of existing. In the following years, David gradually passed more responsibilities to others, remaining active as an advisor and mentor. He developed a specific program to support older people who wanted to make meaningful transitions in their lives. "The idea," he explained in his talks, "is that it's never too late to start over, but older people have specific advantages: experience, accumulated resources, fewer family pressures, long-term perspective." The program attracted hundreds of people between 50 and 80 who were seeking renewed purpose for their lives. David discovered that mentoring people from his own age group was deeply rewarding. At 70, David could look back and see a completely transformed life. The man who had arrived in the forest pushing a wheelchair and carrying guilt and despair had become an internationally respected educator, a community leader, an influential author, and most importantly, a father and grandfather who had created a lasting legacy of positive values. But perhaps what made him proudest was the simplicity of his daily life. He woke each morning in the same tent where he had arrived 25 years earlier, just expanded and modernized. He drank coffee with Jennifer, watching the movement of the community he had helped to build. He spent the day doing work he considered meaningful. He dined surrounded by people he loved and who loved him. It was a life rich not in possessions but in relationships, rich not in individual achievements but in collective contributions, rich not in social status but in shared purpose. If you could go back in time, a journalist asked during an interview for a documentary about sustainable communities, and avoid the crisis that brought you here, would you do it? David considered the question carefully. It's an impossible question, because avoiding the crisis would mean Sarah would still be alive, and I wouldn't give that up for anything. But if you're asking if I would have preferred to discover this way of living without going through the pain, of course I would. But do you think you would have discovered it without the crisis? Probably not. I was too comfortable with my previous life to question if there were better alternatives. So the crisis was necessary. The crisis was a catalyst. It forced me to confront limitations in my previous life model, but the transformation only happened because I chose to accept help and remain open to possibilities that initially frightened me. The interview was included in the documentary that became a reference on intentional communities around the world. David had become not only a successful practitioner of community living, but one of its leading global spokespeople. At 75, David began writing his complete memoirs. It was no longer a practical manual or a manifesto on aging, but an honest narrative of his personal journey from youth to advanced maturity. "I want to put on record," he said to Chloe, who was helping him with the project, "not just the successes, but also the mistakes, the doubts, the moments of weakness, so that people understand that transformation is not a linear or easy process." The memoirs included reflections on each phase of his life: his youth working as a mechanic, his marriage to Sarah, fatherhood, the crisis after his wife's death, his arrival at the community, the years of adaptation, professional development, building a new family, conscious aging. "What impresses me most," he wrote in the final chapter, "is how each phase prepared the next. The technical skills from youth allowed me to contribute to the community. The experience of fatherhood prepared me to educate young people. The pain of loss taught me to value human connections. The years of community adaptation gave me the credibility to lead change. Nothing was wasted. Every joy and every suffering contributed to making me the person I am today. And the person I am today is someone I'm proud of, not for external achievements, but for the quality of the relationships I've built and the legacy of values I will leave." The memoirs were published on David's 30th year in the community. He was 80 years old and had become a respected figure, not only in the community, but in academic and social development circles around the world. Ethan, now an established scientist, had developed technologies that were being implemented in rural communities across several continents. Chloe had become a reference in community psychology, with therapeutic methods being taught in universities. David's grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, had grown up with a natural awareness about sustainability and cooperation that David had taken decades to develop. "Grandpa," said his oldest grandson, now 20, "I want to study education to continue the work you started." "What kind of education?" "Transformative education, teaching people not just technical knowledge, but how to live more consciously and cooperatively." David felt a deep satisfaction. The legacy that mattered most, values and perspectives, was being naturally passed on to a new generation. At 82, David faced his first serious health problem. Pneumonia left him hospitalized for 3 weeks, forcing him to confront his mortality more directly. During his recovery, he reflected on how he wanted to live his final years. The illness had demonstrated his physical fragility, but it had also reinforced the strength of the relationships he had built. The entire community mobilized during his illness. Jennifer coordinated the medical care. Ethan interrupted an international conference to fly back to the US. Chloe cancelled appointments to stay by her father's side. Dozens of former students and collaborators sent messages of support. "You know what amazes me," he said to Jennifer during his convalescence, It's that I'm not afraid to die. Why? Because I know I've lived a full life. I contributed to something bigger than myself. I created genuine relationships. I used my time meaningfully. And is there nothing you wish you had done differently? David smiled. I wish I had found this community 10 years earlier. I wish I had had more time with Sarah living this way. I wish I could live another 20 years to see how the grandchildren will apply what they've learned. But you don't regret any fundamental choices. No. I especially don't regret accepting help when I was desperate. It was the bravest and wisest decision of my life. David's full recovery took months, but he returned to actively participating in community life. His experience with the illness motivated him to develop one last project, a support program for people facing the end of life. I want to help people die with dignity and peace, he explained to the community council, just as we help people live with purpose. The community palliative care program became another innovative model. Instead of isolating sick people in institutions, the community developed ways to integrate end-of-life care into normal social life. Death, David would say in his talks on the subject, is a natural part of community life. When we isolate the dying, we lose opportunities to learn from their wisdom and to offer the comfort of social continuity. At 85, David began to scale back his public activities, but remained active as a mentor and counselor. He spent more time writing, gardening, and talking with people seeking guidance for their own journeys of transformation. One of his favorite activities was telling stories to his great-grandchildren. Ethan and Chloe now had their own children who visited the community regularly. Through these stories, David passed along not just facts about his life, but values and perspectives he considered important. "Great-grandpa, tell the story again about when you arrived here pushing Daddy's chair," asked a 6-year-old great-granddaughter. David told the story many times, always adapting the details for the age of his listeners, but always emphasizing the same themes: the importance of accepting help, the courage needed to start over, the value of community and cooperation. At 87, David began working on what he knew would be his final book. It was a collection of letters for his descendants and for the future generations of the community. "I want to leave a record," he said to Jennifer, now 82. "Not just of what I learned, but of what I hope the next generations will learn and build." The letters addressed themes such as how to maintain community values in an increasingly individualistic world, the importance of balancing tradition with innovation, ways to adapt to climate and social changes while maintaining sustainable principles, the need to continue developing alternative models of education and economy, the responsibility of each generation to leave the world better for the next one. "My generation," he wrote in one of the letters, "had to discover alternative ways to live because the traditional model failed us. I hope you don't have to go through crises to recognize the importance of community and sustainable living. You have the advantage of growing up already knowing these values. Use that advantage to go beyond what we achieved. Create solutions we can't even imagine yet, but always remember that the core, taking care of each other and the planet, remains constant." At 90, David was still lucid and active, though physically more frail. The community had created a care system that allowed him to maintain his independence while receiving the necessary support. Ethan, now in his 60s, had become a global leader in sustainable technologies. Chloe, in her 50s, ran an international network of community mental health centers. Both still visited the community regularly and considered it their true home. "Dad," Ethan said during a visit, "do you know you've exceeded all expectations about what a life can mean?" "How so?" "Most people live one life. You've lived at least 3. The young mechanic and father, the educator and community leader, the mentor and wise elder, and each one was full and meaningful." "They weren't separate lives," David replied. "It was one single life that adapted and evolved, the same essence but expressed in different forms as circumstances changed." "And what is that essence?" David reflected for a moment. "The desire to be useful, to contribute to the well-being of the people I love, to leave the world a little better than I found it." On his 91st birthday, David was surprised by a celebration that brought together over 500 people from around the world. Former students, collaborators, leaders from the international network of communities, family and friends traveled to honor him. The event wasn't just a party, but a conference on the future of the sustainable communities movement. David listened to presentations about innovative projects inspired by his work, technologies developed based on his principles, educational programs that used his methodologies. "It's amazing," he said to Jennifer that night, "to see how ideas can grow beyond their original creators. You planted seeds that sprouted in ways we couldn't even predict. And the seeds will keep sprouting long after we're gone." At 92, David began to show clearer signs of fragility. His memory occasionally failed, and he needed more help with daily activities, but his clarity and wisdom remained intact. During this period, he developed what he called farewell conversations, intentional meetings with important people in his life to express gratitude, offer final advice, and ensure nothing important was left unsaid. "Jennifer," he said during one such conversation, "do you know you saved my life as much as this community did?" "How so?" "When you appeared, I was still living as a widower, trying to raise children alone. You showed me it was possible to love again without betraying the memory of Sarah. You taught me that family can be recreated and expanded. You saved me too, David. I was focused only on work, avoiding personal connections. You showed me it was possible to have a meaningful career and a loving family at the same time." These conversations with family, friends, and collaborators became an important ritual in David's final years. Each one was an opportunity to close circles and impart final wisdom. At 93, David realized he was ready to depart. There were no more essential projects he needed to complete, relationships he needed to repair, or important words he needed to say. "I am no longer afraid," he said to Ethan and Chloe during one of his final family conversations. "I have lived everything I needed to live. I contributed everything I could contribute. I have loved and been loved. I leave a legacy that will continue to grow." "Dad, what is the most important thing you would like us to remember?" asked Chloe. David thought carefully before answering, "That it is never too late to start over, that asking for help is a sign of courage, not weakness, that community and cooperation are not just nice ideals, but practical necessities for a full life, and that every person has the capacity to contribute to something greater than themselves, regardless of circumstances." David passed away at 94, sleeping peacefully on a Sunday afternoon. Jennifer was by his side, holding his hand. Ethan and Chloe were visiting and were able to say goodbye in person. His death was celebrated as he had requested, not as an end, but as a graduation. The ceremony at the community gathered hundreds of people who shared stories about how David had impacted their lives. Ethan read a letter David had left to be opened after his death. "If you are hearing this letter, it means I have completed my journey. Do not be sad for too long. Be grateful for the time we had together and motivated to continue building the better world we began to create. My life proves it is possible to turn disasters into opportunities, loss into purpose, despair into hope. If a broken man like me could create something meaningful, imagine what you, with all your advantages and knowledge, can achieve. Take care of each other. Take care of the earth. Keep innovating, but always remember that real progress is measured not in individual accumulation, but in collective well-being. And when you face your own crises, and we all will, remember that every ending can be a new beginning, as long as you have the courage to accept help and the wisdom to reimagine possibilities. I love you, and I am proud of what we built together. The community David had helped create continued to thrive after his departure. Ethan took on a more active role in technical leadership. Chloe developed new emotional support programs. Jennifer continued coordinating healthcare until her own death 5 years later. David's grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up carrying his values, but applying them to new contexts and challenges he had not foreseen. Some became environmental leaders, others educators, and still others social innovators. The international network of sustainable communities continued to grow, adapting the principles that David had helped develop for diverse cultures and needs. His work had become a global movement, yet always maintaining the local focus he considered essential. 25 years after David's death, the original community celebrated its 50th anniversary. The ceremony included an exhibition about its history, highlighting not only founders like David and Rachel, but the hundreds of people who had contributed to its evolution. A young great-granddaughter of David, now 25, and a doctoral student in social ecology, gave the keynote speech. "My great-grandfather arrived here pushing a wheelchair and carrying despair. He left behind a global network of hope and transformation. His journey teaches us that no crisis is final and no dream is impossible when we have the courage to start over and the wisdom to accept that we need each other. Our responsibility is not just to preserve what he built, but to use its foundations to face the challenges our generation confronts. Climate change, global inequality, social isolation, all demand exactly the kind of community thinking and sustainable innovation he taught us. David always said, 'It's never too late to start again.' Today, I add, it's never too early to start building the world we want to leave for our children." The story of David and his family had become legend, but a living legend that continued to inspire real change in the lives of real people. Every new family arriving at the community seeking a fresh start, every young person choosing a career dedicated to the common good, every person deciding to prioritize relationships over possessions was, in some way, continuing the journey that had begun on a muddy road more than half a century ago. David's true legacy was not in the monuments or institutions bearing his name, but in the daily choices of thousands of people who had learned, directly or indirectly, that a meaningful life is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. That community is not just a place to live, but a way of living, and that every ending can be a beginning, as long as we have the courage to reimagine what our life can be. End of story. So what did you think of this touching story about David and his family? Tell us what moved you most, and if you know anyone who has gone through a similar transformation. We want to know your opinion and where you're watching from. Leave your comment with sincere words, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.